The air in the auction hall was thick with the scent of old money and fresh polish, a cloying perfume that clung to the velvet ropes and gilded frames. Mark Jefferson stood near the back, a quiet island in a churning sea of tailored suits and heirloom jewelry. His daughter, 7-year-old Lily, held his hand, her wide, curious eyes taking in the spectacle. She was the only reason he was here, in the lion's den. Her presence was a shield and a reminder of his purpose. On the block was lot 347, a relic from a bygone era. It was a safe, broad-shouldered, and squat, its dark green paint flaking away to reveal a filigree of rust that spread like a slow-moving disease. The auctioneer, a man with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, did his best to sell it. From the estate of the late recluse Silas Croft. A genuine piece of industrial history, ladies and gentlemen. What secrets does it hold? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. A ripple of polite, dismissive chuckles went through the crowd. This was an art and furniture auction. The safe was a curiosity, a piece of junk theater. Mark's focus, however, was absolute. His gaze was locked on the safe, not as it was, but for what he knew it to be. He had spent 6 months of his life tracking this moment, cross-referencing shipping manifests from the 1970s and obscure estate sale listings. "We'll start the bidding at a symbolic $100, the auctioneer said, a wry smile playing on his lips. $100 for a potential treasure chest, or a very heavy doorstop. Do I have 100? The hall was silent, save for the whisper of silk and the clink of a champagne flute. It was a joke, a palate cleanser before the next Monet print. Mark raised his hand. His motion was small, almost hesitant, but clear. $100, he said, his voice steady and calm, though it felt unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. A new sound entered the room, sharp and derisive. Laughter. It started from a corner to his right, where his late wife's family, the Winstons, were seated. Richard Winston, his father-in-law, a man whose spine seemed to be fused to a rod of pure arrogance, let out a booming laugh that encouraged the others. His wife Eleanor, a woman draped in diamonds and disdain, covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement. Their son Todd clapped Mark on the shoulder from a few feet away, a gesture not of support, but of condescending pity. "Good one, Mark," Todd boomed, his voice carrying across the hall. "Finally investing, are we? Starting small, I see. Very, very small." The crowd, sensing the familial drama, turned their amusement from the safe to the man who had bid on it. Whispers turned to snickers. Mark felt the heat rise on his neck, a familiar burn of humiliation he had endured for years. He was the charity case, the widower of their sainted Sarah, the struggling single father they tolerated out of a twisted sense of familial duty. To them, he was a project, a failure they could point to as a measure of their own success. He kept his expression neutral, his hand still holding Lily's. He squeezed it gently. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed with confusion. "Why are they laughing, Daddy?" "It's okay, sweetie," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "It's a funny-looking box." The auctioneer, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. "I have $100 from the gentleman in the back. A bold bid. Do I hear 150? No? 120? He scanned the room. The Winstons were too busy laughing to bid against their own family joke. No one else wanted it. "Fair warning, then. Going once. Going twice," Richard Winston called out, his voice dripping with mock generosity. "Oh, let him have it. It's the most excitement he's had all year." The auctioneer's face flushed slightly, but he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed the breaking of Mark's patience. "Sold! To the gentleman in the back for $100. The laughter subsided into a low murmur of gossip as the next lot was brought out. Mark lowered his hand, his jaw set. The Winstons thought he was a fool, a pauper playing at being a man of means. They looked at his simple clothes, at the second-hand car he drove, at the small apartment he rented, and they saw the sum of him. They didn't see the years of patient study, the mind that could track complex algorithms and market fluctuations in his sleep. They didn't know that the $100 bill he had just spent was the single best investment in the room. They didn't know that inside that rusted, forgotten box was not just a secret, but a reckoning. Within 48 hours, the laughter would die in their throats, replaced by a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. They thought this was his humiliation. They didn't realize it was the beginning of theirs. If you love a story where the underdog gets their moment, where patience and intelligence win out over arrogance and pride, then you're in the right place. Do me a favor and tap that like button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because the auction was only the beginning. Mark paid the cashier with a crisp $100 bill, the transaction feeling both mundane and monumental. He ignored the pitying glance from the clerk as he was handed a receipt and a large, red paid sticker to affix to the safe. He and Lily walked back to the hulking metal box. It looked even bigger and more dilapidated up close. Rust had eaten away at the corners, and a deep scratch ran diagonally across the front, a permanent frown on its stoic face. "It's ours now, Daddy?" Lily asked, patting a relatively clean spot. The metal was cold to her touch. "It's ours, sweetie," Mark confirmed. He arranged for two of the auction house's movers to help him load it onto a dolly and wheel it out to the loading dock. Even they grunted with the effort, exchanging a look that clearly said, "What a piece of junk." As they waited for the men to maneuver the safe into the bed of his old but reliable pickup truck, his phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. He sighed and answered, putting on the calm, detached voice he reserved for his in-laws. "Mark," her voice was clipped, devoid of any real warmth. "Richard and I were just concerned. Is everything all right? That display at the auction was, well, it was rather embarrassing for everyone." "I'm fine, Eleanor," Mark said, watching the movers strap the safe down. "It was $100. "It's not about the money, Mark, you know that," she said, though it was always about the money with them. "It's the impression it gives. People were talking. It makes you look desperate. It reflects poorly on, well, on Sarah's memory." The mention of his late wife was a deliberate, calculated barb, and it found its mark. A flash of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through his composure. He took a breath. "For Lily, for the plan. I don't think Sarah's memory is tied to whether or not I buy an old safe at an auction." "Well, we do," she snapped. "And Richard is furious. He said it's just another example of your poor judgment. Honestly, Mark, how do you expect to provide for Lily when you're literally throwing money away on garbage?" He could hear Richard's muffled booming in the background. Then another voice, softer, hesitant. "Mom, just leave him alone." Clara, Sarah's younger sister, the silent enabler. She was there, listening, but her defense was as weak as a whisper in a storm. "You stay out of this, Clara," Eleanor hissed, the sound muffled as if she turned her head away from the phone. When she came back, her voice was colder than ever. "We're having a family dinner on Sunday. We need to discuss Lily's future. Your recent behavior has made it clear that you may not be equipped to handle it on your own. We'll expect you at 7. Don't be late." The line went dead. Mark stared at the phone for a long moment. Discuss Lily's future. The words were a threat veiled as concern. They had been trying to gain more control over Lily's upbringing, subtly at first, now more openly. They wanted to enroll her in an elite private school he supposedly couldn't afford, groom her to be a Winston, and erase every trace of her humble, inadequate father. He slid the phone back into his pocket, his hand brushing against a small, worn object, a leather-bound notebook no bigger than his palm. He pulled it out. Its pages were filled with his neat, compact handwriting, notes, calculations, dates, and figures. It was his real ledger, the story of the last 2 years of his life. He flipped to the last page, which contained a single entry under the heading, Croft Estate, Lot 347. He ran his thumb over the numbers, the culmination of his research. The movers finished their work. All set, sir. She's not going anywhere. Thank you, Mark said, handing them a generous tip, which they accepted with surprised gratitude. As he drove away from the opulent auction house, the rusted safe a monolithic presence in his rearview mirror, he felt not humiliation, but a profound sense of clarity. The Winstons had drawn their line in the sand. They had made their final, fatal miscalculation. They saw a man buying a piece of junk. They had no idea he had just purchased the key to their undoing and the foundation of his daughter's freedom. The drive home was quiet. The weight in the back of his truck, a physical manifestation of the future he was about to build. The apartment was small, but it was filled with warmth and light. Colorful drawings by Lily were taped to the refrigerator, and the scent of the cinnamon toast they'd had for breakfast still lingered faintly in the air. While the movers, the same two men from the auction house whom Mark had hired for the afternoon, carefully maneuvered the safe into a corner of the living room, Lily danced around it like it was a mysterious new playmate. "Can we open it now, Daddy? Is there treasure inside? Like a pirate chest?" she asked, her voice full of breathless excitement. Mark smiled, ruffling her hair. "Maybe, sweetie, but this isn't a pirate chest. It's more like a very difficult piggy bank. It's going to take some time and some special tools." Once the movers left, again looking surprised and pleased with the extra cash Mark gave them for their careful work, the apartment fell quiet. The safe dominated the room, its hulking, rusted form a strange contrast to their cozy, lived-in space. It felt like a piece of a different world had landed in the middle of theirs. For the rest of the day, Mark didn't touch it. He made Lily her favorite dinner, macaroni and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, and they ate at their small kitchen table. He helped her with her reading homework, his finger tracing the words in her picture book. They played a game of Go Fish. He was completely present, completely focused on his daughter. This was his anchor, the reason for the storm he was about to unleash. After he tucked Lily into bed, reading her a chapter from her favorite book about a girl who could talk to animals, he finally turned his attention to the safe. He didn't approach it with a sledgehammer or a crowbar, as Todd or Richard might have. Instead, he went to his bedroom closet and retrieved a locked, heavy-duty case. Inside, nestled in custom foam cutouts, were not the tools of a construction worker, but of a craftsman. A high-end stethoscope, a variable speed micro drill with diamond-tipped bits, a fiber optic borescope, and a set of precision lock-picking tools. He sat on a low stool in front of the safe, the only light in the room coming from a single floor lamp that cast long shadows. He placed the diaphragm of the stethoscope against the cold steel of the dial. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, and began to turn the dial, slowly, patiently. It was a process he had practiced 100 times on similar models in his research. Click, whir, thunk. Each sound was a piece of information. As his fingers worked, his mind drifted back 6 months to the origin of this obsession. It had started with a whisper on a niche financial forum, a discussion about the legendary, eccentric investor Silas Croft. Croft had made a fortune in the 60s and 70s by bucking every trend, then vanished from the public eye, becoming a creature of myth. The forum post mentioned his death and the liquidation of his sprawling, disorganized estate. Most analysts dismissed it as a collection of hoarded junk. But Mark, whose real job was not the part-time bookkeeping he told the Winstons he did, but high-level risk analysis for a private equity firm, saw a pattern. He built a proprietary algorithm to scrape data from the estate's preliminary inventory lists, cross-referencing them with Croft's known investment strategies and personal correspondence, which were briefly digitized before being taken down. The algorithm flagged anomalies, items that seemed worthless but were connected to moments of significant financial activity. Lot 347, the Herring Hall Marvin brand safe, was the biggest anomaly of all. It was listed in the manifest of a warehouse Croft had purchased in 1974, the same year he cashed out his entire portfolio just before a massive market crash. Mark had spent weeks, then months, diving deeper. He found old blueprints for that specific model of safe. He learned its weaknesses, its quirks. He read articles about Croft's paranoia, his distrust of banks, his belief in tangible assets. The Winstons saw a man throwing away $100. Mark saw the culmination of 1,000 hours of research, a calculated risk with a probability of success that was, in his estimation, north of 95%. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Mark opened his eyes. Lily stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched in her hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head and padded over to him, leaning against his side. "What are you doing?" "I'm listening," he said. "To the box?" "Yes, I'm listening to the story it wants to tell." She watched his fingers turn the dial. "Is it a sad story?" Mark paused, thinking of the Winstons, of their cruelty, of the judgment he was about to bring down. "I think," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it's a story about justice." He kissed the top of her head. "Come on, little bug, back to bed." As he carried her back to her room and tucked her in, he felt a wave of resolve wash over him. This wasn't just about money. This was about rewriting the narrative the Winstons had forced upon him and his daughter. This was about showing them, and the world, that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account, but by his character, his intellect, and his love for his child. And soon, very soon, he would have the means to make that lesson stick. The following afternoon, the jarring sound of an expensive car horn blared from the street outside, a stark violation of the neighborhood's usual quiet hum. Mark glanced out the window of his small home office, a corner of his bedroom with a desk and a powerful, custom-built computer, and saw a gleaming silver sports car parked haphazardly at the curb, its nose jutting into his neighbor's driveway. Todd, of course. Mark had just finished a conference call with his firm's partners in Zurich, discussing a multi-million-dollar acquisition in the biotech sector. He'd had to mute himself twice to respond to Lily's request for more grape juice. It was the constant balancing act of his life. To his colleagues, he was MJ, the firm's mysterious, brilliant analyst who delivered flawless projections from an undisclosed location. To his in-laws, he was just Mark, the pitiable widower. A loud, insistent knock rattled the front door. Before Mark could even get up, the door swung open. Todd stood there, filling the frame, a smirk plastered on his face. He was dressed in expensive golf attire, as if he'd just come from the country club, which he probably had. "Knock, knock," Todd announced to the empty living room. "Just checking on my favorite charity case. Didn't want you to have hurt yourself trying to open that rust bucket." His eyes landed on the safe, still sitting in the corner. Then they swept across the apartment, his gaze a physical thing, cataloging every perceived flaw. The slightly worn armchair, the stack of library books on the coffee table, the lingering smell of the spaghetti they'd had for lunch. It was a look of profound, unearned superiority. "Geez, Mark, you really live like this?" Todd said, shaking his head with theatrical pity. "Sarah would be, well, she'd be heartbroken to see how far you've fallen." Mark felt the familiar coil of anger tighten in his stomach, but his face remained a placid mask. He had long ago learned that reacting to Todd's provocations was like trying to reason with a brick wall. "Is there something you need, Todd?" he asked, his voice even. "Need? No. But I've got something you need," Todd said, puffing out his chest. He sauntered over to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, helping himself to a bottle of water without asking. "Mom and Dad are worried sick. That stunt at the auction was the last straw. We had a family meeting about you." "You mean you had another meeting where you talked about me?" Mark corrected him gently. Todd ignored him. Look, I get it. It's tough. You're in over your head. You're trying to raise a kid, hold down whatever little job you've got. It's a lot for a guy like you. He took a long swallow of water, then leaned against the counter, adopting the air of a benevolent lord. So, I have a proposition. My friend manages a warehouse for Winston Imports. I can get you a job on the floor. Loading, stocking, that sort of thing. It's honest work, physical, probably good for you. And it pays better than whatever this is. He gestured vaguely around the apartment. The insult was so perfectly crafted, so layered with condescension, it was almost a work of art. He wasn't just offering a menial job. He was defining Mark's station in life, putting him in his place as a blue-collar worker who should be grateful for any scraps from the Winston table. Mark looked at Todd, at his smug, self-satisfied face, and felt a sudden, strange sense of calm. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. The end was near. He could afford to be patient for a little while longer. "Thank you for the offer, Todd," Mark said, his voice so devoid of emotion it was almost robotic. "But I'm not interested." Todd's smirk faltered. He was expecting gratitude, or at least a desperate plea. Refusal was not on the menu. "What do you mean, you're not interested? It's a good job, Mark. For you. You're in no position to be proud." "I'm happy with my current work situation," Mark said. "Your current work situation?" Todd scoffed, his voice rising. "What is that exactly? Part-time data entry? Are you even clearing minimum wage? You have to think about Lily. What kind of future can you give her living like this? We can give her everything. You can barely give her this." He kicked at the leg of the small kitchen table. Mark's gaze hardened. "Don't talk about my daughter." "Or what?" Todd challenged, stepping closer. For a moment, it seemed the carefully constructed civility would shatter. Todd was bigger, more physically imposing, and he was used to getting his way through intimidation. But Mark didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Todd's gaze. "Or I'll ask you to leave my home." There was something in Mark's eyes, a depth of stillness that Todd had never seen before. It was like looking into a deep well and seeing no bottom. It unnerved him. He had come here to feel powerful, to reinforce his own status by highlighting Mark's lack of it. But he was the one who suddenly felt off balance. Todd backed down, disguising it with a laugh. "Fine, whatever. Be a proud fool. But don't come crying to us when you can't make rent. The offer stands. For now." He strode to the door, then paused, his hand on the knob, for one last parting shot. "By the way, I told some of the guys at the club about you and that safe. They had a good laugh. We started a betting pool on what's inside. I put $100 on cobwebs and a dead rat. Hope I win." He slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed in the small apartment. Mark stood motionless for a full minute. He walked to the window and watched Todd's sports car screech away from the curb. Cobwebs and a dead rat. The arrogance, the blindness, it was breathtaking. He turned back to the safe. He had made more progress. He drilled a tiny, almost invisible hole in a specific, structurally insignificant spot he'd identified from the blueprints. Earlier, he had inserted the fiber optic borescope. He hadn't looked yet. He wanted to be sure. He wanted the final tumblers to fall. Now, after Todd's visit, the desire was a burning coal in his chest. He walked over to it, his movements deliberate. The time for listening was almost over. The time for seeing was about to begin. That night, after Lily was fast asleep, the apartment was shrouded in a profound stillness. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of a clock in the hallway, each second falling like a drop of water into a vast, silent pool. Mark sat before the safe, not with his tools, but with a simple cup of chamomile tea, the quiet before the storm. He wasn't thinking about the Winstons or the money or the impending confrontation. His mind was with Sarah. He found himself tracing the outline of her face in his memory, the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she laughed, the determined set of her jaw when she argued a point, the unconditional love in her gaze when she looked at him or Lily. She had been the bridge between his world and the Winstons. She was of their blood, but not their temperament. Where they saw status, she saw people. Where they valued assets, she valued integrity. She had seen him, truly seen him, when no one else in her family could. She knew about his brilliant mind, his quiet strength. "You're like a deep river, Mark," she used to say. "Everyone else is a noisy, shallow brook. They just don't have the patience to see how powerful you are." Her long illness had been a crucible. It had forged his patience into something unbreakable. It had sharpened his focus, and it had exposed the raw, ugly core of her family's character. They had visited her in the hospital, bringing extravagant flower arrangements that filled the sterile room with a funereal scent. Their conversations always circling back to their own lives, their own inconveniences. They had offered money, not as a genuine gesture of help, but as a way to assert control, to make him feel the weight of his inadequacy. He had politely refused every offer, liquidating his own considerable, hidden investment portfolio piece by piece to pay for the best care, a fact they were blissfully unaware of. They assumed he was drowning in debt. They preferred that narrative. His last promise to her, made in the hushed quiet of a hospital room in the dead of night, was a whisper. "I'll protect her, Sarah. I'll make sure Lily has everything she needs. Not what they think she needs, what she really needs. A good life, a happy one, I promise." This whole endeavor, this patient, methodical quest, was the fulfillment of that promise on a scale he hadn't imagined at the time. It was about securing Lily's future so completely that the Winstons and their toxic influence could never touch her again. He finished his tea and set the cup aside. The time for reflection was over. He had done the work. He had listened to the tumblers. He had mapped their secrets. The final combination, a sequence of numbers he derived not just from the sounds, but from a date he'd found in Silas Croft's hidden journals. The day of the 1974 market crash was set in his mind. He knelt before the safe. His hands were steady. He reached for the large, spoked handle. It was cold and unyielding. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, and began to turn the dial. Left to 28. The click was solid, a sound of deep satisfaction, like a key finding its home. Right, past 28, to 52. Another click, this one higher pitched, sharper. The second tumbler fell into place. Left to 9. The third and final click. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but he felt it resonate through the metal, a vibration that traveled up his arm. A quiet thud from deep within the safe's mechanism signaled that the bolts had retracted. He paused, his hand hovering over the handle. This was the moment. Months of research, a lifetime of being underestimated, all of it culminating in this. He thought of the laughter in the auction house. He thought of Todd's sneering face. He thought of Eleanor's venomous words on the phone. He gripped the handle firmly. He pulled. At first, nothing happened. The door was sealed tight by decades of grime and atmospheric pressure. He planted his feet, engaged his core, and pulled again, putting his entire body into it. A low groan, a sound of protest from the rusted hinges, broke the silence. A line of dust and rust particles fell to the floor. The seal was breaking. He gave one final, mighty heave. With a deep, resonant thwump, the heavy steel door swung open. A wave of musty, dry air washed over him, the smell of old paper in sealed time. He peered into the darkness. The interior was not empty. It was not filled with cobwebs and dead rats. It was packed to the brim. Neatly stacked, wrapped in oilcloth, were objects that made his heart beat a little faster. He reached in and his fingers brushed against something solid, metallic and heavy. He pulled it out into the light. It was a gold bar. Not a large one, but dense, its weight surprising and absolute. Stamped on its surface were the words, Credit Suisse, 10 ounces, 999.9 fine gold. He reached in again. There was another, and another. He began to pull them out, lining them up on the floor. 10, 20, 50 of them. They gleamed dully in the lamplight, a river of quiet, solid wealth. Beneath the gold were several canvas bags, surprisingly heavy. He opened one. It was filled with pre-1965 silver dollars, their value not in their face, but in their melt. And beneath all that, at the very bottom, were 3 leather-bound ledgers and a thick, oilskin-wrapped package. This was the real prize. The gold was wealth. The paper was power. He carefully lifted out the package and the ledgers. He sat back on his heels, surrounded by the contents of the safe. The floor of his modest living room was now paved with a fortune. The sheer scale of it was staggering, more than his most optimistic projections. He had estimated, based on Croft's known habits, that it might contain $1 million, maybe $2 million worth of tangible assets. A quick mental calculation told him the gold alone was worth nearly $4 million. But Mark's eyes were fixed on the ledgers. He opened the first one. The pages were filled with Silas Croft's meticulous, spidery handwriting. It was a diary of his trades, his thoughts, his paranoia. It was a map of a brilliant, troubled mind. He opened the second ledger. This one was different. It was a record of private loans, high-interest notes made to desperate businessmen in the 1960s. Mark's eyes scanned the names. He saw a few familiar ones, titans of industry who, it turned out, had started their empires with Croft's secret backing. Then he opened the third ledger, and that's when his world, and the world of the Winstons, shifted on its axis. On the 5th page, dated October 1968, was an entry that made his breath catch in his throat. The name was written in Croft's precise script, Richard Winston, Sr. It was Richard's father, the patriarch who had founded the Winston import-export empire. The entry detailed a substantial loan, $50,000, a massive sum at the time, given to the elder Winston to save his failing business from bankruptcy. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the oilskin package. He carefully untied the twine and unfolded the stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a single, folded legal document, preserved in near-perfect condition. It was the original loan agreement between Silas Croft and Richard Winston, Sr. He read the terms. The interest rate was astronomical. But it was the collateral clause that made him stop breathing. If the loan was not repaid in full by the agreed-upon date, Silas Croft would be entitled to a 51% controlling interest in the newly solvent Winston Company, to be held in perpetuity by him or his estate. Attached to the back of the document with a rusty paperclip was a second, smaller note. It was a signed affidavit from Croft's lawyer at the time, stating that Richard Winston Sr. had died before the loan was repaid, and his son, the current Richard Winston, had refused to honor the debt, claiming no knowledge of it and threatening legal action. The lawyer had advised Croft that pursuing the claim would be a long and costly court battle. Croft, ever the eccentric, had apparently decided to just wait. He had tucked the contract away in his safe, a ticking time bomb, and let the interest and his claim compound for 50 years. Mark sat back, the document resting in his hands. The safe didn't just contain $4 million in gold. It contained a bomb. It contained the original sin of the Winston Empire. Their entire fortune, their status, their country club memberships, their condescending laughter, all of it was built on a lie, a stolen foundation. And now he held the deed. He was, for all intents and purposes, the majority owner of Winston Imports. He looked at the gold gleaming on his floor, and he almost laughed. The money was a footnote. This document, this was justice. This was the fulfillment of a promise he didn't even know he was making. The game was over. All that was left was to announce the checkmate. The phone call was a masterpiece of understatement. Mark waited until the next morning. He had spent most of the night methodically cataloging and securing the contents of the safe. The gold and silver were now locked in several new, discreetly purchased safety deposit boxes across the city. The ledgers and the crucial loan document were in a fireproof briefcase that did not leave his side. He had slept for 2 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, and had woken with a singular, crystalline purpose. He dialed Eleanor's number at precisely 9 a.m., knowing she would be in the middle of her post-breakfast, pre-charity luncheon routine. She answered on the second ring, her voice already laced with irritation. "What is it, Mark?" "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. His voice was different, and he knew it. The faint tremor of anxiety that had always underscored his interactions with them was gone, replaced by a solid, calm authority. It was the voice he used with the partners in Zurich. "I need to call a family meeting. I'd like to come to the house tonight, 7 o'clock. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The directness of the request, the lack of apology or deference, threw her off. "A family meeting? We already have one scheduled for Sunday." "This can't wait until Sunday," Mark said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "It concerns Lily's future, as you wish to discuss. It's important that you, Richard, and Todd are all there." He could hear the suspicion in her voice, but it was colored by her own arrogance. She could only interpret his actions through the lens of her own prejudice. She heard his new tone not as confidence, but as desperation. He was finally cracking. He was coming to beg. This was the moment she and Richard had been waiting for. "Oh," she said, a note of triumphant condescension creeping in. "You've finally decided to be sensible, have you? Very well. Richard has a dinner engagement, but I'm sure he can be persuaded to be home for something this important. We will expect you at 7. And Mark," she added, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "do try to look presentable." "I'll be there," he said, and hung up before she could say another word. He spent the rest of the day preparing, not his appearance but his case. He made copies of the loan document and the affidavit. He prepared a concise summary of the contents of the safe, a simple list of assets in their current market value. He also printed out a one-page summary of his own finances, a consolidated statement from his private investment accounts, showing a net worth that would, he knew, shatter their perception of him into a million pieces. He arranged for a babysitter for Lily, a trusted neighbor, telling her only that he had an important business meeting. As he got ready, he chose his clothes with care. Not a fancy suit, which would look like he was trying too hard. Instead, he wore a simple, well-fitting pair of dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and the comfortable leather shoes he'd had for years. He looked not like a beggar nor a king, but simply like himself, a man comfortable in his own skin. The only accessory was the slim, fireproof briefcase he carried. Meanwhile, at the Winston estate, a different kind of preparation was underway. Eleanor had called Richard, her voice electric with victory. "He's broken, darling. He's coming to us, on our terms. He's going to hand Lily over." Richard, who had been about to close a deal on the golf course, felt a surge of satisfaction. "I knew it," he boomed to his golfing partners. "The man finally came to his senses. You just have to be firm with his type. They eventually understand who's in charge." He called Todd. "Be at the house at 7. Mark's coming over, cap in hand. I want you there to see it. It's time we finalize the guardianship papers for Lily." The Winstons gathered in their cavernous, marble-floored living room, a room designed to intimidate. They were a united front, a tribunal ready to pass judgment. Richard poured himself a glass of outrageously expensive scotch. Eleanor touched up her lipstick. Todd paced like a caged animal, eager for the kill. Even Clara was there, summoned by her mother. She sat on the edge of a silk-covered sofa, twisting a ring on her finger, her face pale with anxiety. She had a bad feeling about this, a sense that they were all standing at the edge of a cliff they couldn't see. "All right, everyone," Richard announced, raising his glass. Let's be clear on the plan. We listen to his pathetic whining. We let him beg. Then, we lay out our terms. We take over Lily's education fund, we get her into a proper school, and we make it clear that he is to have a supervised role in her life, at our discretion. We are saving that child from a life of mediocrity. Is that understood? Eleanor and Todd nodded eagerly. Clara said nothing, staring at the intricate pattern on the Persian rug. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. The maid went to answer it. A moment later, Mark walked into the room. He paused at the threshold, his calm eyes taking in the scene. The three of them, poised like predators. Clara, a frightened ghost on the sofa. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in her direction. Then he met Richard's gaze. "Mark," Richard said, his voice magnanimous, dripping with false warmth. Come in, come in. Have a seat. Can I get you a drink? Something to take the edge off?" "No, thank you, Richard," Mark said, his voice resonating in the high-ceilinged room. "I prefer to keep a clear head." He did not sit. He walked to the center of the room and placed his briefcase on the large glass coffee table. The soft click of the latches echoed in the sudden silence. The reversal was about to begin. The air in the room was thick with unspoken expectations. Richard, Eleanor, and Todd looked at Mark, their faces a mixture of pity and predatory glee. They saw a man who had come to surrender. They were waiting for the plea, the admission of defeat. They were about to be very, very disappointed. Mark did not sit. He stood in the center of their opulent living room, a calm, solid presence. He looked from Richard's smug face to Eleanor's triumphant one, to Todd's impatient sneer. His gaze finally rested on Clara, who looked as if she wanted to disappear into the cushions of the sofa. "Thank you all for meeting me," he began, his voice calm and measured. It was the voice of a man chairing a board meeting, not one begging for help. Eleanor was right. We need to talk about Lily's future. But before we can do that, we need to clear up some misunderstandings about the present. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Richard swirled the scotch in his glass. "Misunderstandings? Mark, I think we have a very clear understanding of your situation." "Do you?" Mark asked, a genuine question. "Let's see. You believe I am financially unstable, a man of poor judgment who throws his money away on junk. You believe I am incapable of providing for my own daughter. You believe my home is inadequate and that my work, whatever you imagine it to be, is menial. Is that a fair summary?" Todd snorted. "Sounds about right to me." "Good," Mark said, nodding. "Clarity is important." He reached into his briefcase and took out a single sheet of paper, placing it on the glass table. "This is my consolidated financial statement as of this morning. Please, have a look." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Mark, we're not interested in your community college savings account." "Look at it," Mark insisted. His voice was still quiet, but it held a new, unyielding edge. Curiosity piqued. Todd snatched the paper from the table. He glanced at it, his eyes scanning the columns of figures. His smirk began to twitch. He looked again, his eyes widening. He read the number at the bottom of the page, a number with 2 commas and 7 digits to the left of the decimal point. "What is this?" Todd stammered, his face paling. "Is this a joke?" He thrust the paper at his father. Richard took it, annoyed. He put on his reading glasses, his expression one of weary condescension. He looked at the paper. His hand, the one holding the scotch, froze midway to his mouth. The color drained from his face. He read the number again, as if willing it to change. He looked up at Mark, his eyes filled with disbelief and a dawning, horrified confusion. 7 million. What is the meaning of this? "That's a conservative valuation of my personal portfolio," Mark explained calmly. "It doesn't include my salary, my performance bonuses, or my equity stake in the firm. I'm a senior analyst for a private equity group based in Zurich. I work from home. It allows me to be there for Lily." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint sound of Eleanor's sharp, shocked intake of breath. She stared at Mark as if seeing a stranger. The narrative they had so carefully constructed, the one that defined their relationship with him, had just been blown to pieces. I don't believe you, Eleanor whispered. You're lying. Am I? Mark replied. He pulled a second document from his briefcase. This is a list of assets found inside the safe I purchased at the auction. He placed it on the table next to the first statement. The one you all found so amusing. Richard, his hands now trembling slightly, picked it up. He read the list aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper. 500 10-ounce gold bars, 4 bags of pre-1965 silver currency, assorted bearer bonds. He trailed off, his eyes wide. The current market value, it's over $4 million. $4,260,000 as of this morning's gold price, Mark corrected him gently. But that's not the most valuable thing I found. The Winstons were reeling. Their world was tilting on its axis. The pauper was a prince. The fool was a genius. The roles they had played for so long were suddenly, terrifyingly, reversed. Richard looked at the 2 papers in his hand, then at Mark. The pity was gone, replaced by a raw, naked emotion. Greed. My God, Richard breathed. That's family money. Croft was an old acquaintance of my father's. That's safe. It belongs in the family. It's part of Sarah's inheritance. No, Mark said, his voice dropping, losing its dispassionate tone and taking on the weight of judgment. It's not, and Sarah's name is the last one you should invoke right now. He reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out the oilskin-wrapped package and the third ledger. He placed them on the table with a soft thud. You're right about one thing, Richard, Mark said, his eyes locking onto his father-in-law's. Silas Croft was an acquaintance of your father's. He was the man who saved this family from ruin. He unwrapped the package and unfolded the 50-year-old loan document. He spread it flat on the glass table, its aged parchment a stark contrast to the modern, sterile room. I believe you'll recognize your father's signature, Mark said quietly. This is a loan agreement between him and Silas Croft from 1968, a loan that saved Winston Imports from bankruptcy, a loan that was never, ever repaid. He pushed the document across the table. The reversal was no longer just beginning, it was complete. The judge was now the defendant, and the sentence was about to be read. Richard stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. He saw his father's flamboyant signature at the bottom, a signature he had seen 1,000 times. He read the terms, his face growing paler with every word. Then he reached the collateral clause. 51%, controlling interest. This is preposterous, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He looked at Mark, his eyes wide with panic. It's a historical artifact. It's meaningless. It's past the statute of limitations. Is it? Mark replied, his voice a blade. My legal team seems to think otherwise, especially since the debt was actively concealed by your father and subsequently by you. The contract is what's known as an in perpetuity clause, tied to the asset itself, the company. It doesn't expire. And Silas Croft's estate was never settled. Until now. He gestured to himself. I am the sole legal representative of the Croft estate, which means, Richard, that for the last 50 years, you haven't been the owner of your company. You've been the manager, and your performance review is long overdue. The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Eleanor let out a small, strangled cry and sank into a chair, her hand flying to her chest. Todd, who had been frozen in disbelief, finally spoke. No, no way. We'll fight this. We'll get our lawyers. You can't just walk in here and steal our company. Steal it? Mark's voice was dangerously quiet. Was it stealing when your grandfather refused to honor his debt? Was it stealing when you built an empire on a fraudulent foundation? This isn't theft, Todd. This is a collection. A debt has come due. He opened the ledger he had placed on the table, turning it so they could see the meticulous entry. Silas Croft documented everything, including the meeting where your father, Richard, denied the existence of the loan and threatened to ruin Croft's lawyer if he pursued it. The final piece clicked into place. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a documented history of their family's deceit. There was no escape. They were trapped by their own history, a history Mark had literally purchased for $100. Richard Winston, a man who had commanded boardrooms and brought competitors to their knees, finally broke. He collapsed into his own armchair, the scotch glass slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the marble floor. The sound was unnaturally loud. "What do you want?" he rasped, his face a mask of despair. He looked like an old, defeated man. "The money from the safe? Take it. Take all of it." "You still don't get it," Mark said, shaking his head slowly. "I don't want the money. I have my own." He looked around the room, at the priceless art, the antique furniture, the symbols of a life built on a lie. "This has never been about money. This is about respect. It's about integrity. It's about the long list of grievances you have so arrogantly compiled." He began to pace slowly, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "It's about the constant, condescending remarks about my job, the whispers behind my back at family gatherings, the way you treated my wife, your own daughter, like a disobedient asset when she chose to marry me. It's about you, Eleanor, calling me on the phone to tell me I was an embarrassment, that I was failing as a father. It's about you, Todd, showing up at my home to offer me a job loading boxes, as if I were your serf. It's about you, Richard, laughing in a public place while my daughter stood next to me, making her feel ashamed of her own father." He stopped in front of Richard. "You ask me what I want. I want you to understand, for the first time in your life, what it feels like to be powerless. I want you to feel what it's like to have your entire world, everything you built, resting in the palm of someone else's hand." His gaze swept over them, three broken figures in their self-made prison. But his eyes lingered on the fourth person in the room, Clara. Throughout the entire confrontation, she had remained silent, a statue of conflicted misery. Now, as Mark's speech concluded, she finally moved. She stood up, her legs unsteady. Her face was streaked with tears. "He's right," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right about all of it." She turned to her parents, her eyes blazing with a pain and anger that had been suppressed for years. "We did this. We were cruel and blind and arrogant. Sarah saw it. She tried to get away from it, and we never, ever listened." She looked at Mark, her expression one of profound apology. "I am so sorry, Mark, for all of it, for every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken up." It was the first crack in the Winston facade that came not from external pressure, but from within. It was the first and perhaps only sign of genuine remorse. The final, devastating blow had been delivered, not by Mark, but by one of their own. The House of Winston had fallen. The aftermath was a deafening silence. The shattered Scotch glass on the floor seemed to be the perfect metaphor for the family's state. Richard sat motionless, a fallen king on his throne-like chair. Eleanor wept silently, her perfect makeup finally ruined. Todd stared at the incriminating documents on the table, his face a cocktail of rage and impotence. Mark let the silence hang in the air, allowing the full weight of their new reality to settle upon them. He had brought the storm, and now he would dictate the climate that followed. He was not a man of vengeance. He was a man of order, and order had to be restored. "So, what now?" he said, his voice returning to its calm, businesslike tone. "You have two options." He directed his gaze at Richard, who looked up, his eyes pleading. "Option one," Mark began, "is the legal one. I file a lawsuit on behalf of the Croft estate to claim its 51% controlling interest in Winston Imports. We go to court. This loan document, along with Croft's ledgers and the corroborating evidence of your family's concealment of the debt, becomes public record. The press will have a field day. Winston Empire built on 50-year-old lie. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your credit lines will be frozen. Your business partners will abandon you. You will be ruined, publicly and professionally. When the dust settles, I will own your company, and you will be left with nothing but legal fees and shame. He let that vision sink in. He saw the flicker of terror in Richard's eyes, the utter devastation on Eleanor's face. Option 2, he continued, is my offer. You will agree to a private sale. I will purchase your 49% stake in the company. Not at market value, of course. That ship has sailed. I will purchase it for a price of my own choosing. The price will be generous enough for you to live out the rest of your days in comfort. You will have a nice house, but not this one. You will have money in the bank, but you will not have an empire. You will retire. You will sign non-disclosure agreements that will be mercilessly enforced. You will disappear from the world of business and society, and you will live quiet lives of reflection. He paused. In essence, Richard, I am offering you a choice between total annihilation and a comfortable, quiet life of obscurity, the life you always assumed I was living. It was poetic justice, so pure and so complete it was almost cruel. He was offering them not destruction, but a mirror. Richard seemed to struggle for words. Why? He finally managed to choke out. Why would you do this? After everything, why not just destroy us? Mark looked at him, and for a moment the mask of the stoic analyst slipped, and the man, the father, the widower, was visible. Because of Sarah, he said softly. She loved you in her own way, despite everything. And because of Lily, I don't want my daughter to grow up knowing her father destroyed her grandparents. I want her to grow up knowing her father was a man of integrity, who, when given absolute power, chose to wield it with mercy. He turned his attention to Clara, who was still standing, watching him with a mixture of awe and shame. And for you, Clara, there is a third option. You have a choice to make. You can tie your fate to theirs and fade into obscurity with them, or you can forge a new path. There will be a place for you in the new company, if you want it, a chance to help rebuild it on a foundation of honesty, a chance to be the person you were always meant to be, away from their shadow. The choice is yours. It was a lifeline, an unexpected branch of redemption offered in the midst of judgment. Clara looked at her parents, then back at Mark. The decision was monumental, a severing of the old and the embrace of a terrifying, unknown future. She started, her voice thick with emotion. I need to think. Take your time, Mark said. He began to gather his documents, his movements precise and unhurried. He placed the copies on the table and returned the originals to his briefcase. You have 24 hours to decide, he said to Richard. My lawyer will be in touch with yours tomorrow morning with the formal offer. I suggest you accept it. He snapped the briefcase shut, the sound final and absolute. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. He looked back at the wreckage of the Winston family. One more thing, he said. The family dinner on Sunday is canceled. From now on, any discussion regarding my daughter will be conducted through me, and me alone. And you will refer to me as Mr. Jefferson. With that, he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the cold, marble mausoleum and its inhabitants to their fate. He had walked in as their charity case. He walked out as their salvation and their judge. The air had never tasted so sweet. The stars had never seemed so bright. The days that followed were a blur of legal activity. Mark's attorneys, a top-tier firm he had on retainer, moved with swift, surgical precision. The Winstons, faced with the undeniable evidence and the threat of public ruin, folded completely. Their high-priced lawyers, after one look at the Croft contract, advised them to take whatever deal they were offered. Richard, Eleanor, and Todd signed the papers in a sterile conference room, their hands shaking, their faces grim. They sold their shares in the company their family had controlled for half a century for a price that was, as Mark had promised, enough to ensure a comfortable life, but a mere fraction of what they believed they were worth. They were forced to vacate the mansion, which was technically a corporate asset, within 30 days. The empire had crumbled, not with a bang, but with the stroke of a pen. Clara, after a long, soul-searching night, called Mark. Her voice was hesitant but resolved. She accepted his offer. She wanted a chance to build something real, something honest. She started at the bottom, learning the import-export business from the ground up, not as a Winston, but as an employee. Her colleagues knew nothing of her past, only that she was a quiet, hard-working woman determined to prove her worth. The relationship with her parents and brother was shattered, perhaps irreparably. It was the painful price of her own redemption. Mark, now the majority owner of a massive, if poorly managed enterprise, threw himself into its restructuring. He was no longer just an analyst, he was a leader. He promoted competent people from within, implemented new, more efficient systems, and established a corporate culture based on transparency and integrity. He started a charitable foundation in Sarah's name, funded by a percentage of the company's profits, to support single parents and their children. But the biggest changes were personal. He sold his small apartment and bought a beautiful house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion like the Winstons, but a warm, welcoming home with a big backyard and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. Lily fell in love with it instantly. One sunny Saturday afternoon, a few months after the confrontation, Mark was in the backyard, pushing Lily on the swing. She was laughing, her hair flying behind her, her feet kicking towards the sky. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" she squealed with delight. Mark smiled, his heart full. This was it. This was the treasure. Not the gold, not the company, not the victory over the Winstons. It was this moment, the simple, profound joy of being a father. He had the wealth to give her anything she could ever want, but he was determined to give her what she needed: his time, his love, his unwavering presence. They still went to the library every week. They still made macaroni and cheese. Their life was bigger, but its core was unchanged. Later that evening, after Lily was in bed, Mark sat in his new home office. On his desk, next to his state-of-the-art computer, sat the small, rusted dial from the old safe. He'd kept it as a reminder that the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight, dismissed by those who lack the vision to see. A reminder that true worth is not about a polished exterior, but about the hidden strength and integrity within. He thought about the Winstons, now living in a modest condo in a different state, stripped of their power and prestige. He felt no triumph, no lingering anger, only a quiet sense of pity. They had spent their lives chasing the wrong things, measuring themselves by the wrong standards. They had confused wealth with worth, and in the end, they had lost both. The story of the auction, the safe, and the quiet, single dad who turned the tables on a powerful family became a sort of legend in the financial world, whispered in boardrooms and on trading floors. But for Mark, it was never about the legend. It was about a promise to his late wife to protect their daughter, a promise to himself to live a life of dignity and purpose. He had faced humiliation and had not broken. He had been given immense power and had not become a tyrant. He had learned that the greatest victory is not in crushing your enemies, but in rising above them, in choosing integrity over vengeance, and in building a future worthy of the love that set you on your path. The gold in the safe had secured his daughter's future, but it was the strength in his own character that had truly made them rich. And so we come to the end of our story. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That what we see on the surface is often the least important part of a person. True value lies in the unseen, in character, in patience, in intelligence, and in love. Have you ever been in a situation where you were underestimated? How did it feel when you finally proved them wrong? Let me know your own stories in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story of vindication and justice satisfying, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more tales that prove that the good guys, with a little bit of strategy and a lot of heart, can and do win in the end. Until next time, remember to look past the rust. You never know what treasure you might find.